The neocon boomers surrounding Donald Trump are mortgaging my generation's future for another endless, maybe endless, but another very expensive Middle Eastern war. We tried this with Iraq. We tried this with Afghanistan. It left us in trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. We pay $1 trillion per year just on the interest for our debt. This is amassing, and it's going to affect my generations for decades to come, because the old people know they can start wars because young people don't have the power to stop them. So the old people make us foot the bill. Listen,
is it
1 minute ago,
How do you know?
1 minute ago.
Are you on the phone? You got Pete Hegseth on that phone?
I'm not. It's funny to me that 1 minute ago you said Senator Chris Murphy was not trustworthy, but in your mind, Pete Hegseth is trustworthy.
I actually said he was
okay,
partisan.
but in your mind, Pete Hegseth is not partisan
and left a classified briefing
okay.
just to come out and poop on the.
Is Donald
American
Trump
military.
partisan in his rhetoric around this? Is Pete Hegseth? Is Lindsey Graham? I can point to anyone in this administration that is leading this effort, and they are hyper partisan, and they're honestly making us look bad. We Americans should be terrified about this.
In today's video, Adam Mockler goes nuclear on Lydia Moynihan. If you look at the last 2 decades, the US has spent trillions on wars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, with long-term costs still piling up through debt, veterans care, and economic strain. And yet, we're hearing a lot of the same arguments being recycled again. There's also a bigger pattern people are starting to notice. Decisions being made at the top, while younger generations deal with the consequences, whether that's higher costs of living, instability overseas, or even being the ones sent into conflict. But before we dive into today's video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one.
A few things. First of all, my grandpa moved from Syria in the early 80s, and my dad's whole side of the family, they are Muslim. So anti-Muslim bigotry has been around for decades and decades. I will say, my grandpa who moved here, the Muslim community he lives in Indiana, is full of doctors, heart surgeons, people who have helped their community. I also find it very ironic that Republicans are so welcoming to any form of bigotry. They're so welcoming to anti-trans bigotry. They're so welcoming to anti-Muslim bigotry. You're making a face, but these are bigoted comments they made. But the moment that bigotry is targeted towards them, they freak the hell out. You have to stop any bigotry before it enters your movement. I just find it funny when Randy Fine will be super Islamophobic, but then he'll be on the floor whenever something is directed at Jewish people, which, by the way, you should never be bigoted towards anybody. Stop the bigotry before it enters your movement. But how do you only micro-focus on for certain forms of bigotry?
I don't think there's anything any Republican in Congress could do right now that would get condemned by Mike Johnson, because the practical thing is he has got a 1-vote cushion, a 1-vote margin, because Thomas Massie often votes against Republicans. And so, you know, we saw him for the last couple of weeks stay mum and not condemn Tony Gonzalez and make him resign, despite that he had been having an affair with a staffer who ended up dousing herself with gasoline and setting herself on fire and dying. And so there is nothing that any Republican can do right now that Mike Johnson is going to condemn.
Is that true? That Mike Johnson will not draw a line anywhere, even here?
What Mike Johnson said is, he said people who refuse to assimilate and follow a radical ideology that seeks to commit violence and terrorist acts have no business being in the country. I think most people would.
Well, that's not what he was asked about.
He was asked about. Most people would agree with that.
He was asked about 2 congressmen who said Muslims have no place in American society, and one of them saying, as Jamil points out, that if it's a choice between dogs and Muslims, it's not a difficult one. He wasn't asked about people with radical ideologies. He was asked about Muslims.
But the only reason
he actually said
the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful.
I think it's a great tactic to try to answer a different question than was asked. But the actual question is there a line anywhere right now on Capitol Hill or elsewhere in the Republican movement when it comes to anti-Muslim?
I can't speak for Mike Johnson, but I would say we've had 2 terrorist attacks here in the last 10 days.
What does that have to do with Muslims?
So can we condemn those? Why are we?
Of course. What does that have to do with Muslims?
What does that have to do with Muslims?
There is a radical strain of Islam that's led to these terrorist attacks. Obviously, the vast majority of Muslims are
people
peaceful.
with terroristic ideologies here and all around the world. What does that have to do with whether Muslims belong in American society as a group?
Yeah, and let's be clear.
I'd like her to hear the answer.
I'm talking about what Mike Johnson was saying.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what he
But
didn't
you haven't
say.
read his full quote. He said,
what I'm talking about is what
we can
he
be tough
didn't
on Islamic
say.
extremism without compromising our commitment to religious liberty.
Now, if you actually look at the data, the vast majority of terrorist incidents in the US over the past decade have not been linked to Muslim extremists. Reports from agencies like the FBI and studies from groups like the Anti-Defamation League have consistently shown that domestic extremism, especially from far-right groups, has been a bigger threat in recent years. So when the conversation shifts to blaming an entire religion, it's just not grounded in reality. And there's also a constitutional piece here people forget. Religious freedom isn't optional, it's literally protected under the First Amendment. That means you don't get to pick and choose which religions belong in American society based on current events. Once you start going down that road, you're undermining a core principle of the country. Historically, we've seen this pattern before too. After 9/11s, there was a huge spike in anti-Muslim hate crimes, even though Muslim Americans were also victims of those attacks and have served in the US, military, government, and healthcare systems. Entire communities got blamed for the actions of a few, and years later, most people agree that kind of reaction went too far. And the inconsistency point matters. You can't claim to stand against bigotry while only calling it out when it affects your own group. If the standard is that discrimination is wrong, then it has to apply across the board. Otherwise, it stops being a principle and just becomes politics. So yeah, this isn't just about one comment or one moment. It's about whether we're actually being fair and consistent or just reacting based on fear and convenience.
But I think it's so fascinating because back in the day, Trump used to call Lindsey Graham and his ilk warmongers.
Yeah.
He used to suggest that it was like Dick Cheney and Lindsey Graham and a cabal together. He now has Lindsey Graham in his ear every day. And I think that's what some people are worried about, is that the mission creep has already begun. Trump has already shifted from saying that he was anti-war to being very interested in doing whatever he thinks he needs to do.
You want to know what makes me so angry listening to people like Lindsey Graham and listening to the $1 billion a day toll? Is that the neocon boomers surrounding Donald Trump are mortgaging my generation's future for another endless, maybe endless, but another very expensive Middle Eastern war. We tried this with Iraq. We tried this with Afghanistan. It left us in trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. We pay $1 trillion per year just on the interest for our debt. This is amassing, and it's going to affect my generations for decades to come, because the old people know they can start wars because young people don't have the power to stop them. So the old people make us foot the bill. And you know what I don't like the most out of all this is the gaslighting. They say that it's fiscally irresponsible for us to invest in healthcare, for us to invest at home and my generation in the future. The Affordable Care Act subsidies that they were arguing over were $50 billion. $50 billion. And they've already asked for $50 billion. So there's just no.
I can see. I am, from the wing of the party that doesn't ascribe to the Lindsey Graham, let's root and toot and shooting kind of stuff. Like I just don't believe that. But the thing he said that we didn't put on the TV screen, and I think is very accurate, is that you can't allow a regime that routinely chants death to America to have enriched uranium. You can't allow a regime that routinely and often
what
and
if they
frequently,
do? What if they don't get the enriched uranium, which it seems like they acknowledge?
Adam's angle holds up when you look at the numbers and history. The US has already spent over $8 trillion on post 9/11 wars when you include long-term costs like veteran care and interest on the debt. And that interest alone, it's now one of the fastest growing parts of the federal budget. So when people talk about another prolonged conflict, it's not hypothetical. We've literally seen how expensive it gets, even years after the fighting slows down. There's also the whole mission creep problem, which has happened multiple times before. Iraq started as eliminating weapons of mass destruction, then turned into regime change, then nation building. Afghanistan went from targeting Al-Qaeda to a 20-year war with shifting goals. Once objectives start moving, it becomes way harder to define when you're actually done. And on the nuclear side, there's something else people don't always mention. Military force alone has rarely stopped nuclear programs permanently. In a lot of cases, countries just rebuild or go further underground. That's why past strategies countries combined diplomacy, inspections, and pressure. When those agreements were in place, enrichment levels were actually capped and monitored. Once those deals collapse, things tend to accelerate again. Then there's the generational impact Adam's hinting at. Younger Americans aren't just paying for this through taxes, they're the ones who would potentially serve, and they're the ones dealing with long-term economic effects like higher debt and reduced government spending flexibility in the future. That's not political, it's just how the budget works. So this isn't really about disagreeing on the goal, it's about whether the strategy makes sense, whether it's sustainable, and whether people are being upfront about what it's actually going to cost. Because history shows those costs are almost always bigger and longer than expected.
To lawmakers that they won't.
In
And
their
in which case,
acknowledgement,
all of this
in their
is for
acknowledgement, they're
what?
acknowledging that number one, the bombing raid last year wasn't complete, that the JCPOA was moot, that this country has continuously sought to enrich uranium for weapons purposes over the last 40 years. You cannot let
The JCPOA was
I'm talking. You let this country exist for 40 years where they routinely empowered and financed their proxies to attack innocent civilians in the entire region. You cannot let this country have a nuclear war. That is the moral justification of the war.
Sure.
Maybe Lindsey
But
Graham
if they
shouldn't be.
if they don't
rooting
actually accomplish that objective, then what's the point?
that should be the objective.
I think that's really where we
I
are
can
right
agree
now.
that they shouldn't have
So-
nuclear weapons, but it just bothers me that 8 months ago they named this the 12-day war. And maybe that war was contained within 12 days, but we're like 200 days out and there is still a war going on. So they are just saying that the war is over and then changing the guidelines or the goalposts on their justification over and over.
He's talking about
The 12-day
one
war, but
last
it's still
year.
When you
going.
talk about catastrophic consequences as a result of what's happening at the Strait of Hormuz, we've now Trump lifted sanctions on Russia. And so, I feel very bad for Ukraine today.
Just think about how much chaos the Trump administration has caused in the past few weeks. They have spiked oil prices. They've shuttered stock markets across the globe. They posted a tweet today. Our energy secretary, Chris Wright, posted a tweet today saying that a ship was escorted through the Strait of Hormuz, and he deleted it within 10 minutes, which just absolutely blew up markets across the globe. Donald Trump has made the world more catastrophic after saying that he would be America first, anti-interventionist. He said that he was a populist, make America great again person. But instead, Russia now has more ability to not only kill Ukrainians, but to target or to help Iran target U.S. troops. We saw 8 U.S. troops die. Hold up. We saw 8 U.S. troops die. And when we learn that Russia is providing Iran with intelligence, this administration is apathetic to it. They're like, oh, they're not doing as good of a job as they could. They said that Russia might not, what did they say? Russia isn't doing a good job helping Iran because Iran's not doing well. They're just apathetic to the fact that our
If
enemies
Iran
are
is denied a nuclear weapon, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Of course, it's a good thing. Of course.
So is it worth taking some strategic risk? Is it worth taking some economic risk?
The word
to
strategigic,
achieve that
I'm
goal?
going to take problem with the word strategic. There was no strategy from this. Listen,
is it
1
worth-
minute
How
ago,
do
is
you
it
know?
1 minute ago.
Are you on the phone? You got Pete Hegseth
Listen,
on that phone?
I'm
over
not.
there?
It's funny to me that 1 minute ago you said Senator Chris Murphy was not trustworthy, but in your mind, Pete
No, I said he was
Hegseth is
partisan.
trustworthy.
I actually said he was
okay,
partisan.
but in your
I
mind,
said he
Pete
was extremely
Hegseth is not partisan.
and left a classified briefing
Okay.
just to come out and poop on the
Is Donald
American
Trump
military.
partisan in his rhetoric around this? Is Pete Hegseth? Is Lindsey Graham? I can point to anyone in this administration that is leading this effort, and they are hyper partisan, and they're honestly making us look bad. We Americans should be terrified about
Lydia?
this.
The economic impact alone is real. Even small disruptions or uncertainty around the Strait of Hormuz can spike global oil prices almost instantly. About 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that route. That's why markets react so aggressively to even a single headline or tweet. We've seen this before. During past Middle East tensions, oil shocks didn't just affect gas, they drove inflation across entire economies. Then there's the Russia angle, which complicates things even more. If sanctions are loosened or enforcement weakens, it gives Russia more revenue, especially through energy exports, which can then be used to fund ongoing conflicts like Ukraine. At the same time, geopolitical alliances shift, and countries like Iran can end up benefiting indirectly through shared interests or intelligence overlaps. That's not speculation, that's how global power dynamics tend to work in multi-front conflicts, and the strategy question matters a lot here. In past conflicts, lack of a clear inconsistent plan is what caused situations to spiral. Iraq and Afghanistan both started with defined goals, but evolved into long, expensive engagements with unclear endpoints. When decisions start being made reactively instead of strategically, markets, allies, and even military planning all become less stable. There's also the communication issue. In today's world, one statement or even a deleted post can move global markets in minutes. That's not just about optics, that's about credibility. When messaging is inconsistent or unclear, it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly what markets and allies hate the most. So this isn't just about whether one outcome is good or bad, it's about whether the approach is actually thought through, whether the risks are being managed properly, and whether people both in the US and globally can trust what they're being told. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center, are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out Ground News in the description down below.